Hi, I'm Alec from EasierHabits.com. I coach working parents in how to design lives of joy, balance, and growth. So I was working on a video of couples communication exercises, but as I was diving into reading about them, especially focusing on a book called 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work, I was surprised at how much the advice for couples that are having chronic issues, chronic conversations that are really struggling, actually apply not only to couples, but to so many conversations, especially social and political conversations these days. So instead of listing out a bunch of exercises that I believed would be great for couples who are in a generally positive place and seeking to level up their communication, I thought I would actually go a little bit more basic and talk about exercises we can do when we are in high conflict conversations, what we can do to calm ourselves down and bring that calmness into the conversation to de-escalate conversations. We can't control whether other people are in an emotionally heightened state or not, but blaming them and being defensive doesn't help. We can be calm ourselves and we can open up space for them to safely calm down. And so this is helpful. This is something we can use in our relationships as parents. This is something we can use with our kids. And this is something I am myself still struggling to use in crazy, crazy conversations that have happened this year where people are very angry and very scared from not only the right and the left, but independents and many different parties as well. So what you will get in this video is one counterproductive mindset, the mindset that leads to fear and resentment, anxiety and frustration, and why this mindset, why people will resort to it, but why this doesn't get you what you want, and the mindset that will free you up to be calm. And from there, we will dive into 4 easy tips to calm yourself down, or I should say 4 simple tips to calm yourself down, right? There is a skill to being able to practice emotional regulation, especially in heated context, but these are very simple things you can apply. You can start practicing some of them right now, and the skill and confidence and calmness in heated situations really comes from practice. So it's not something that's you're gonna snap your fingers with and it's gonna change your life, but it will let you know how you can calm down in situations, because a lot of these times you can go into a conversation and you didn't even mean to have that argument and it blows up and it becomes a huge thing and people are frustrated and things escalate and you're like, how did that even get here? Well, I will give you the signs that something is going wrong, as well as 4 tips that you can practice so that when you jump into those conversations and they escalate, you can try and de-escalate them, or afterwards, if you've forgotten these tips, you can look back and say, wait, I know where this went off the rails. I could have done X. And this will help you establish a sense of calmness and confidence. Even just knowing there are things you can do that could be calming down this conversation will help you and start the process. So like being aware of these things will help you, but the skill that you, and the confidence in these skills comes from practice. And while these things are simple, that practice is not always easy in heightened conversations. So while I was researching couples communications, I came across a quote I really liked about couples communication exercises. It said, "These conversations are not about getting your partner to agree with you. They are about hearing and deeply understanding them, and doing so with kindness and respect." And as I listen to this, I'm like, oh, yes, that's what we need. That's what we need not only in our marriages and our parenting, but what we need as a society. Wow. The anti-pattern here, what a lot of people fall into is, instead of seeking first to understand, it's seeking to be understood. And not only that, a lot of people don't even necessarily seek to be understood. A lot of people seek control as a proxy for understanding. Now, this is my personal experience as a parent. What I have observed in kids is kids have a hard time understanding the adult world. And especially when there's something frustrating or scary that they don't understand, or when I've been dictating things and not giving them any choice, then I notice that my kids will put their foot down and make demands of me. So one of my kids in particular, when he gets into a really intense tantrum, and I'm trying to calm him down, he will just make demands. Like I'm trying to do breathing exercises with him, and I tell him, all right, let's do the breathing exercises together. And he'll say, no, Dad, you do the breathing exercises. And, I'll try and calmly explain to him, I'm happy to do breathing exercises. It does help me stay calm in this situation. But my breathing exercises won't calm you down. You need to practice this yourself, right? But it is not the contents of the demand that necessarily even makes sense or is the goal. The goal here is that my son doesn't understand why he's frustrated. He doesn't understand why he's in an emotionally heightened state. And he is, as a proxy for understanding, trying to control me. He thinks that if I do these things, if I do something, then he will do it. And I've actually done that. I've actually given in to his demands and done breathing exercises, and it didn't de-escalate the situation at all, right? And this is because demanding control instead of seeking understanding is counterproductive. And I'll walk you through an example. So my lovely wife and I are actually somewhat, at least in our relationship, conflict averse. We don't actually criticize each other a lot. So I'm drawing on an example, and actually a lot of the things I'm drawing on come from the 7 principles of making marriage, or 7 principles for making marriage work. And so, an example might be spouse comes into the kitchen has food all over it, and the spouse is frustrated. And so you could do a number of things, right, in the situation. But if the first thing you do is just say, oh, this kitchen is messy, why don't you just clean it up now? Your spouse may comply and they may clean up the kitchen. But the problem is you don't understand why they left it messy, and they don't understand why you're so upset about it. Maybe they think you're just having a bad day, and so this is like a one-off thing they need to do. They don't recognize that this is a long-standing pattern that has upset you, right? And so the very next day or the next week or whatever, you see the kitchen's messy again, and you're right back at square one. You're frustrated, like, oh, you're so lazy. Why aren't you cleaning up after yourself in the kitchen? And so that's why control is not a proxy for understanding. Now you contrast this with a seek first to understand mindset, right? You walk into the kitchen, what could you do? Well, you could do 2 things. One, you could seek to be understood first and explain why it's stressful, and say, hey, I see the kitchen is really messy right now. It makes me feel like I have to clean up after you, and I have a lot of things to do, so that's stressing me out. And that is seeking to be understood, and is still actually better than example 1, because you are at least letting them know that this is frustrating. You might also explain, like, I feel like I have to do this a lot. I'd really rather not. And then that way you'd be letting them know that, this isn't just today, this is a pattern of behavior, right? But you're seeking first to be understood. The problem is this still cuts off conversation. You still haven't understood why they did what they did. And even if they recognize that this means stress for you, they might inadvertently recreate that stress because the mess might be created by patterns they're not entirely aware of, right? Contrast this with a seek first to understand mindset. So you go into the kitchen and you see the mess and you say, hey, I see there's food out on the counter. Why'd you leave the food out on the counter? And so your spouse might say something like, whoa, yeah, one of the kids got this big old cut, and so I rushed to put on the Band-Aid, totally forgot about it. And you might realize, like, whoa, in this instance, I just understand. I might have left food on the counter in the same way. And that understanding itself might immediately lead to peace, right? But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you ask a question and it might be like, the game started and I forgot about it, right? That might still be frustrating to you, but at least you started to understand their pattern. And then you can, once you understand other people, you can make requests that actually resolve the situation. So rather than just, will you clean this mess up right now? That doesn't help them clean it up in the future, or even this situation generally stresses out, can you clean up after yourself more? You can actually ask something very specific, very implementable, which is, hey, well, next time, can you make sure you put your food away before you sit on the couch, right? And then that will help give them a cue, and they'll realize like, oh, not only do I need to be clean, here's specifically how I can be more clean, right? When I sit down to watch the game, or before I sit down to watch the game, I'll make a habit, a routine of cleaning up after myself, and that might reduce at least one source of your stress in a reoccurring fashion, right? And that's why seeking to understand will help you calm down, and not only calm down in the moment, but actually fix problems and resolve them in such a way that you can work together peacefully rather than continually retreading the same arguments that slowly get heightened the more you feel like you have to address that frustration or anxiety. So there are 4 signs, again, from the 7 principles for making marriage work, that you're treading into this control and resentment territory. So the first sign is criticism. And what is meant by criticism in this context is not just a complaint about a specific instance, but a complaint with a little bit of judgment. So if you come in and just say, the kitchen's messy, could you clean it up? That might be like a specific complaint. Where that becomes criticism is where you walk into the kitchen and say, the kitchen's messy, you always leave it messy, could you please clean it up, right? That's moving from just a request in this situation to a judgment about the person. And the key indicators of this are just using absolutist language, always, never, in situations where you're talking about a group of people, generalizing to the group of people, all these people always do X, those are good signs of that this is a criticism, and not in the constructive or precise criticism way, but in a negative way for couples communication or just communication generally, right? And so that is the first sign that you are treading down this path to serious and chronic resentment. The second sign in a communication is when criticism becomes contempt. And so it is at this point completely removed from the request, right? Criticism might have a request kind of embedded in it, like clean up the kitchen. Contempt is purely trying to emotionally manipulate someone, to belittle them, to snarl. You're so lazy, this kitchen is disgusting, right? There's not even a request in there. That would be contempt. And I actually ran into a situation in a political conversation online where I'm an independent. I will criticize or point out what I think is good about any and all parties. And a lot of people who are very partisan get frustrated with me because of this, right? I had one person comment on a post this week saying that the Venn diagram of Trump supporters and neo-Nazis and white supremacists is practically a circle, right? Basically, a very fancy way of saying all Trump supporters are Nazis, right? Again, so that you can see that's kind of the language of judgment, but there's no request there, right? There is no, hey, if the right would do X, then great. Or I want the right to do X. I want them to do this thing as just purely contempt, right? It is a conversation to belittle. And I'll come back to this conversation because this sparked some of my thoughts this week, and probably the most challenging conversations I have, because my wife and I don't tend to argue a lot, is actually in political context or with tantruming kids. So that is contempt. And then the third signal that things are going off the rails and proceeding in this kind of control and resentment mindset is defensiveness. So when you're faced with contempt, when you're faced with someone insulting you, then your instinct is to say, no, I don't do that. I never do that. You're wrong. And then often even this segments back into contempt, right? And what about when you do this, or you're such a nag, or whatever that is, right? And so often really toxic conversations will just alternate between defensiveness and contempt. Defensiveness, contempt, defensiveness, contempt. The fourth reason, or the fourth sign that things are going off the rails in a control and resentment pattern is really that stonewalling. And so this is in an online context, a social media context, blocking, banning, retreating into your echo chambers. But I also see this with my kids sometimes when they are frustrated with a conversation. So if one of them hits the other and I am very persistent in asking them, hey, why did you hit your brother? They might hit a point where they say, well, I'm not even listening to you, or I'm not talking about this anymore. And that's the little kid version of stonewalling. And so, of course, yeah, your spouse might do that as well in an argument. And this looks different than retreating for calmness, right? You could say, hey, things are getting intense. Let's come back to this after we've had a chance to calm down. That is not stonewalling, right? Partially because you're acknowledging that there is something unresolved that you want to come back to. You just want to come back to it in another state. Stonewalling is, I don't want to hear about this at all, and no acknowledgement, just leaving and trying to avoid the situation. So if you find one of your communication channels, one of your relationships going down a control and resentment pattern, there are 4 tips I'll give you that will help you ground yourself and bring that calmness and that seek first to understand mentality into the conversation. And of course, you cannot control whether somebody else is in a heightened state. What you can do is control whether you are and create openings where they can de-escalate. All right. And some of these things are things I'm still working on. They are things that can be very simple to understand, but they are complex to practice. So if you want that confidence that you can meet difficult conversations from a place of calmness, it will take a lot of practice over time. However, I always find that even just knowing some options for what I can do to create a better outcome starts for me to calm me down. The idea that, hey, a lot of times when I've gotten into escalated conversations, I might start that normally, and then I have a loud voice to start with, but voices get raised even louder, things get escalate until we're arguing about something that wasn't even on my mind earlier, and I think, wait, how did that happen? Well, my hope for these 4 tips is that either after the fact that you can at least know, oh, I could have done X, Y, Z to de-escalate that conversation, or even better, that you start bringing those into your conversations and de-escalating them in the moment, right? But just knowing them and being able to review a tense conversation and recognize after the fact will be the first step of practice for many people. It's okay if it doesn't occur to you in the moment. These conversations are difficult. It will take a lot of practice and thought to get to a point where you can use these comfortably in a conversation. I'm still struggling with it in certain very tense conversations, like people have been having about politics in the past week. So communication tool number 1 for de-escalating situations is recognizing when you're experiencing emotional flooding, when your emotions are running away with you. And you can recognize that physically in the body. You might have flushed cheeks. You might feel a lot of tension in your face, around your eyes or forehead or neck or shoulders. You will have to be in tune with whatever it is that you feel when you're angry or anxious in your body, but start to listen to that. And when you recognize that, take deep breaths. And studies have found that it is a minimum of 6 deep breaths you need to actually physiologically calm down. Some studies have found a lot of benefit from a particular exercise, which is where you breathe in for a certain count and breathe out for twice as long. So you might breathe in for a count of 3 and breathe out for a count of 6. Or you might breathe in for a count of 4 and breathe out for a count of 8. This is shown to increase heart rate variability, or in less fancy terms, just the ability of your heart rate to go from a fast, intense, anxious, or angry freakout to a slow, calm heart rate, right? And so this is just a physiologically based way to help calm yourselves down. Our minds aren't floating around in a vacuum. They are very much influenced by our physical state. When we notice our physical state getting out of hand, we can tend to that. That will, in turn, have a positive calming effect on our thoughts and our emotions. Communication tool number 2 for de-escalating tense conversations is being able to recognize when someone is not responding to your question or comment and ask yourself questions. So a first tendency of a lot of people when someone says something that doesn't make sense is to criticize or label it. And I have found even when someone says something that I don't understand and I try to ask questions about it or say like, look, this doesn't make sense. Here's an example where that doesn't work. This is very engineering type behavior. When I do that, that doesn't necessarily de-escalate the situation. So you can take a step back and ask, do I understand what this person thinks the topic is about? And I have had 2 arguments in the past few weeks where when I actually step back and realize like we don't seem to be talking about the same thing. What could this person be talking about? And then actually, this bleeds into step number 3, but actually ask them what they're talking about. I realized like they were arguing about something completely different. And actually what they thought we were arguing about, like we were in complete agreement on. And that is, so like the first thing is just recognizing that the disconnect, when someone says something that doesn't make sense, it's because you're not understanding, right? It's not because they're an idiot. And so that for a lot of people is a sticking point. I see this more in social and political conversations. Less so, I don't see that as much in my own family. You might see it with couples that are farther along in the control and resentment pattern where they might start to criticize something because it doesn't make sense rather than asking, wait, I don't get why you said that. So first, don't even ask questions though. Just ask yourself, do I understand what this person is talking about? Are we on the same page? Do I understand what matters most to this person or what they're most worried about right now? Asking those sorts of questions to yourself can help. Now, if you're in the middle of a tense conversation, that might mean you say, hey, look, this is getting tense. I'm going to go take some deep breaths. I'm going to think about this. Let's come back to it. If you're in an asynchronous conversation, sometimes that space is built in for you, but you can ask those questions of yourself. And that helps you recognize that you are seeking first to understand, right? Rather than to make that person understand that you think their point is wrong. Communication tool number 3 is leading with questions. And so I had a conversation on social media that I talked about a little bit earlier, and I was trying to lead with questions, but there are better questions and worse questions. So this person was making comments that just didn't make sense, the Venn diagram one, and I asked questions like, I thought, like, what do I not understand? I don't understand how you can argue that 65 million people are literally neo-Nazis, not just neo-Nazis, but neo-Nazis who want you dead. And I asked that question, and that was received as more criticism, right? And I just wanted the answer. Like, I was like, wait, okay, make an argument if that's the argument you're making. And that did not help at all. So what I have come to realize, and this is a hard one for me, is that while I made a post about a particular topic, this happens a lot in social media, people come in and their comments are about something completely tangential. They're not actually responding to or your question or comments. You've already recognized that in the previous step. And this is the step where instead of trying to get them on track to the conversation you want to have, even if you're asking them questions, you want to actually ask them the conversation they want to have. Basically, I have found no magic way to make somebody have the conversation you want to have or talk about your topic, right? If a person especially is in a heightened state, they will be around a particular track. Those tracks are usually set by stuff they read and watch constantly, and there's no way you can move forward until you actually understand what they need. So what's a question you could ask? You could just ask them straight up, all right, what am I not getting here? What do you feel misunderstood about? What are you most worried about here? Ask that question that allows them to have the topic of conversation that they want. And they were going to be talking about it anyway, no matter what you were talking about. So you might as well stop where you are, take that breather, let them have their say in their conversation, right? And that takes work, right? I keep assuming when I write things like, oh, this is a response to what I'm writing, even if it doesn't make sense, and I try and like jam it into the conversation. And so steps 2 and 3 really help with those conversations that go off track, and they really work with kids too. So a lot of times, kids' perspective is very different than adults because they're paying attention to different details, and you might have missed some of those. And so a kid might be really worried about something, and so for example, one of my kids has a very high bunk bed, and he was worried about it. And I thought maybe because it's high or because it's shaky, right? I made up a whole bunch of assumptions. It didn't really make sense to me why he was worried about this bunk bed, because he'd slept in a bunk bed in our last house, and he slept in that bunk bed for quite some time, right? And so I was like, wait, why are you afraid of this and wanting to sleep on the floor all of a sudden? Instead of, trying to have a conversation about, it's not really any higher than your other bed, or you were sleeping on it before, like the topics I wanted to address, I just asked him what he was worried about. And it turns out to be that he just had a series of nightmares in that bed, and for some reason was convinced that he would continue to have nightmares in that bed. And so eventually we told him like nightmares come and we could address that conversation, but we started having the conversation he wanted to have. And rather than the conversation I thought we should be having. And trying to read his mind, right? That doesn't work. And it doesn't work with your spouse either, of course. So giving them a chance when they're coming in hot and you don't understand why, to say, oh, wait, okay, what is it that you think we're talking about? Or what is it that you're worried about? And let them have their conversation. So communication tool number 4 for keeping your calm and de-escalating tense conversations is stating your common ground. So this is something that is easy to overlook. I do it a lot, which is I focus on differences and tease them out and compare them, or argue about them, or criticize them. But a lot of times when a communication is really tense, it's not the logic of the conversation or the topic of the conversation that is really creating the tension. It's the fact that somehow one or both of you are losing sight of the shared humanity and shared suffering of each other. And so the biggest thing you can do, and the most important thing, and more important than any subtopic you can do, is simply reaffirm your common humanity and common experience. And so taking this back to the social network example, so when this person says like all Trump supporters are white supremacists and neo-Nazis who want me dead, instead of interrogating, I could ask the question like, what is the conversation you want to have? Right? Well, I want to have a conversation about like how we don't have to worry about white supremacy or something like that. And, I could simply say, I'm worried about white supremacy too. I'm not a fan of it. A lot of Trump supporters aren't, right? Affirming common ground, and leave it at that. So this is where the judgment comes in, and this is judgment in practice. And again, with really intense conversations like this, I'm still working on this. But the idea of like, some people, once you've heard them and say, I'm worried about that too, will be ready to move on to a conversation. Other people, what you need to leave them with is, hey, there is some shared humanity. There's a shared concern here. And that is more important than anything else you can talk about, right? So you don't want to overshadow that by moving into something else. And really, the difference between the two is letting the other person lead. So usually just let that comment sit. If it's in a comment thread, don't reply again, or don't clarify anything else you've said previously or respond to any other points. Just say, I'm worried about that too. And that is something I did where my friend on a different page said, I just want to go one day without having to think about fascism. And I just commented, me too. And I hope that, reaffirmed like, hey, we're both concerned with this. We both like a better world, even if we're talking past each other online. And so that is really the skill of prioritizing the actual relationship above the content of the relationship. And this is a big thing. This is a big deal for people. it works powerfully with little kids who are so quick to forgive. A lot of times they are worried about the relationship, right? If you have an argument, they're worried that you don't love them anymore because there was an argument. And so the root of the matter is like, hey, I love you. I want your well-being. That's why I was worried about this, is I was worried for your well-being. And when they understand that, they feel loved. They feel secure in the relationship, right? And again, adults aren't always so different. Our spouses, right? If we go back to the kitchen cleaning example, you might have a spouse that comes in and says, the kitchen is messy. You left the food out again. Can you please clean it up, right? And you can say, hey, wait, this seems to be a big problem. Like, you seem really frustrated about this. Why? You're like, why is this bothering you? Let them say their piece, and then you can say, then you can say, oh, I get why that would be stressful for you. In the previous example, where your partner says, this is, I feel like I have to clean up after you and I have a lot of things to do and it's stressing me out. You say, I understand why that's stressing you out. I don't want you to feel overloaded. For those extra points, what else can I do? But lead with that understanding. And you might leave it there. Again, actually, you might wait with the what else can I do, and say something like, yeah, I understand why that would be very stressful. I don't want you to have to clean up after me. And let it sit. And then, let that sink in. Let your partner process that. Because that's the other thing. We're used to like cheap information from the internet that like flies at us, just like facts, like the garbage facts that may or may not mean anything, that have very little context, that are in one ear and out the other. But actually hearing that someone values your relationship, hearing that someone shares your suffering, or hearing that someone wishes you well and doesn't want you to suffer, those are things that take a moment to sit in. They're simple ideas, but they work a lot more powerfully if you let them sit and marinate a while. That gives the other person a chance to realize, especially if there's silence, they might start to realize where there's tension in their body, and they might actually just instinctively start to do tip number 1 and calm down. And so just to recap, that the communication tool number 4 is just to state your common ground with that person, that you are concerned, find a concern you are shared with. And now, of course, don't lie about it. You don't want to say like, oh yeah, I hate a messy kitchen too. That may not be true, but it can be true that you don't want your spouse to feel stressed about the messy kitchen, right? And your understanding can start from there. That could be what you share. So I hope this video has been helpful. We've covered the control and resentment mindset that just leads to more fear and anxiety and resentment and anger. We've also talked about the understanding first mindset, and how when you recognize that you're going along a control and resentment pattern with criticism, with contempt, with defensiveness, or with stonewalling, you can use these 4 communication tips to de-escalate in yourself and then bring a sense of calmness to the conversation. So those tips are, again, recognizing the tension and the emotional flooding in your body, and then taking the deep breaths, count for 3 or 4 on the in-breath, count for 6 or 8 on the out-breath, take it 2 times as slow. And if you do that 6 times, that is shown to help your body achieve a calmer state, where your heartbeat is beating less rapidly, and that will bleed into your thoughts and emotions. Of course, tool number 2 was recognize when someone is not answering your questions or responding to your comments, but they are making comments or asking questions that don't seem to track for you. And then when you recognize that, ask yourself, what is it that I'm not understanding? What is this person talking about that I'm not getting? What is most important to them? What are they worried about? What is their priority here? You think about those questions, and then you ask an open-ended question. This is tip number 3. Ask an open-ended question that allows them to introduce the topic that they're talking about, right? They may have hijacked what you thought was your conversation with a completely different topic. Well, if they're in an emotionally heightened state, you're not going to get them to talk about whatever it is your original topic was until they feel heard and they are no longer in an emotionally heightened state. So you give space for them to raise their concerns and acknowledge them. And that acknowledging is step number 4, where you state your common ground. And of course, this is most powerful if you paraphrase what you're hearing. What I'm hearing is, or what it sounds like is this. And then you state your common ground. That gives them a chance to correct you if your understanding is not correct, but it also gives you a chance to both focus for a moment, slow down from the fast words and for the things that are being said, and refocus on the fact that the relationship and the communication channel is more important than the content of the conversation. Now, if this has been helpful for you, please hit the like button. Please hit subscribe. I am trying to help people de-escalate tense conversations, and we're having so many tense conversations. With COVID, there's extra stress on families. With political craziness, there are just a whole lot of people who are super frightened, super anxious, super angry, and we need more people who are practicing calmness. So share this video, or take these tips and teach them to other people, bring them to your conversations. Go ahead and recognize other people who are speaking in calm, respectful manner. I think that's another thing. We often get a lot of clicks on the internet for people who are being angry and as outrageous as possible. As long as we're rewarding people for being angry, that's what we're gonna get. So whether or not you like or subscribe this video, and I hope you do, please just, whatever conversations you have, call it out when you see people de-escalating conversations. That is just so more powerful. Or when you see a well-reasoned argument, someone who's being thoughtful, whatever side it's on, whether or not you agree with it, promote that. Promote the smart people in your opposition. Promote the well-reasoned arguments, even if you don't agree with them, or even if there's counter arguments that they haven't addressed. Please, please, please do what you can this week and probably this month, and who knows for how long, but do what you can to de-escalate conversations. If you have questions or advice, if you have questions about couples communications especially, but if you also have questions about how to have less charged political conversations, please put them below. Again, maybe your comments could help other people have ideas for how to have better conversations. I really think that we can get back on track and have a less angry and anxious society. And let's just work together, do our best, and be examples, and be calm ourselves, and bring that to the conversations we have, and recognize when other people do that as well. I think we can make a big difference. So thank you for watching. And as always, until next week, make big changes, one small habit at a time.